Hello everyone! This is going to be a slightly different reading from what I usually do. This is an idea that I've had for a long time now, and I've always toyed with the idea of kind of giving my thoughts on stories at the end, but I didn't really want to clutter these videos up, but I think this might be a good place to try this. See, I'm a huge fan of, like, the early 2010s style Lost episode creepypastas, but of course it's often really hard to find good ones, and the ones that are good kind of tend to become classics, you know? And it's certainly the Lost episode creepypastas that are the most ripe for cliches, because, you know, some of the earliest creepypastas were Dead Bart and Suicide Mouse, and everything since then has been kind of trying to ape those ideas. And so that's why these things are universally laughed at for their, you know, gore and adult themes in children's shows, of insane creators going rogue and making these episodes, and then the company quickly sealing them away and disappearing people who try to talk about them. It took something that was scary to me when I was 14 or 15, and it's kind of made them almost parodies of themselves. There's a lot of bad Lost episode pastas out there, but I still find the concept itself to be very fascinating, because it's a genre where there's a level of separation, you know, between the storyteller and the viewer, and the actual media itself. There's a lot of different ways it can go. I've been pretty out of the loop on these things for a long time, so I figured this would be a good opportunity to just kind of Google, like, alright, what are some good Lost episode creepypastas, and just see what I get. So as I'm reading these, I'm reading them for the first time. I am not planning these out in advance. I think it might be kind of fun, because I imagine that these are creepypastas that are popular enough that a lot of you will probably have heard of them before, and so it would be kind of like getting an outsider's perspective on something that's been, like, established as classics. Okay, so I haven't talked about this in a very long time. This happened to me when I was 10 or 11. My dad had bought us a Scooby-Doo VHS tape of an episode which I can't fully recall. All I can remember is that it was about a little girl's ghost haunting a whole town. Our parents didn't go out very much, since my brother suffers from asthma and they were very protective of him. But one night they had this important party thing and decided to call a babysitter. I remember getting upset and telling them that I was old enough to take care of my brother, but they didn't listen. They left us with this freckly 15-year-old neighbor girl called Amanda or something. Before leaving, Dad gave us the tape, which got us pretty excited, as it would be the first time Dad let us use the VHS player. After they left, we all noticed that the tape was kind of weird. The art on the cover looked handmade somehow. Scooby looked really terrified, and the ghost girl was really creepy. I remember Amanda calling my dad a weirdo for buying such a thing for us, but I assume he just picked up the first tape he saw. I also remember that Amanda didn't want to play the tape, but after my brother and I insisted for almost an hour, we finally sat in front of the TV to watch the thing. The episode itself was kinda boring. There were almost no jokes, and it wasn't that scary. But I do remember being surprised that the ghost from the cover didn't look at all like the one in the video. I don't really remember the plot of the episode. I guess it was pretty much the usual, and Amanda would repeat, "Stupid show," every 5 minutes. Close to the end, when they got the ghost and were about to unmask her, something weird happened. All the Scooby Gang stopped talking and looked at the camera with a really sad and serious look on their faces. They stared at us for a very long time in silence. Even the background music had stopped. The only person not looking at us was the ghost girl, but she suddenly lifted her head and stared at the camera with terrible eyes wide open. The final credits came abruptly after that. We all stared at the TV without saying a word, until the tape finally stopped. We were shocked. My brother looked at us and said something like, "I can't believe Shaggy died. This is so messed up." We both looked at him confused, and Amanda asked what he was talking about. He insisted that it was stupid to kill a character and then bring him back to life in the next episode. She got really nervous and told him that Shaggy didn't get killed. that the ghost girl disappeared right after they caught her, and the episode finished with the whole gang scared to death. Nothing made any sense. I couldn't understand a thing. When I told them what I saw, Amanda freaked out. She said at least 10 times that it wasn't funny and left our house, pissed off and, I assume, scared to her bones like we were. After discussing for at least half an hour, we decided to put the tape in and watch it again. We turned on all the lights and pushed rewind. The thing is, when we got to the part where they get the girl, the episode suddenly ends. Nothing happens. They get the girl and there is no unmasking, no killing, and no staring. It just ends there. We stopped the tape and ran to our room. My brother had an asthma attack, and I stayed by his bed crying and praying that he wouldn't die. Eventually, we fell asleep. The next morning, my brother started acting like nothing happened. After insisting for about 2 days, he told me he never wanted to talk about it again, and that was it. I think I actually never told anyone about this. It feels good to share it. Alright, full disclosure, this is the only one of the bunch that I actually have read before. In fact, I read it years and years ago on the channel. I think what's so creepy about this one, and also what makes it so immersive and comfy in that way, is that it focuses not just on the events of the episode itself, but really about the circumstances surrounding it. You know, what this person's family is like, what everyone is doing in the room, and what their attitudes are towards this viewing. It's stuff like that that makes it feel like we're in the room watching it with them. And that's why it's able to get away with not really having much happen in the episode itself. This one is not bogged down in the description of events. In fact, it makes the rare choice to have the episode pretty much progress as a normal episode, right up until an ending that isn't overtly messed up. It's just sort of strange and out of place. The kind of thing that gives you pause just because it comes out of nowhere. Even just by having the difference in design from the box art to the show itself, it kind of plants the idea in our head that there is something wrong with this ghost girl, with the monster of the week, I guess. And that's why it's so interesting that the episode progresses normally until right at the end, we close on her being the last to move and look at the camera. But even then, we don't get any more to work off of than that. It's nothing to do with our experience of the episode itself that actually gives this story its sting. It's the retroactive look of what everyone else saw. We don't get to see exactly what they saw either. None of them ever take the time to sit around and describe it. We only have their immediate knee-jerk reactions at the end of the episode to learn that they all saw something different, but all something weird. And when they go back to watch it again, it's almost like there's something wrong specifically with the end of the episode. The fact that nothing happens, literally no footage, without that bigger audience. Or maybe with a knowing audience. We never learn what the nature of this is. You could sort of get the idea that it's something to do with the ghost girl herself, but really, we're just speculating now. It leaves so many unanswered questions, and that's what I love about it. Especially because, you know, the medical emergency forces them to kind of immediately move on from it. They don't get to linger on it. I also like that what we get of the babysitter's ending is in a similar vein to the narrator, where they catch the ghost girl, she disappears, and the gang gets scared. It's kind of more of a real ending than what we got. But the one we learn the least about is the brother who only says that Shaggy died. And we get no further details about what he saw, and he's not talking. I'm definitely a sucker for simple stories, and I really like this one. It's one of my favorites, honestly. But on to the next. I'm not expecting anyone to believe me when it comes to this story, but hear me out. It was just this Christmas that went by, and things were getting busy. I had to start buying presents for the family. I had finished shopping, but I still needed to grab a present for my little cousin. She's not very hard to shop for since she's 4. She likes things like Peppa Pig and My Little Pony. She really liked, and I say liked for a reason, Max and Ruby. So when I decided to go looking for a present, I figured something like a Max and Ruby DVD would have been perfect, since she liked to watch it on a daily basis. However, Christmas meant that most of the online DVDs were sold out in most places. I went to look on eBay as well, but I figured I couldn't trust what condition the DVDs would have been in. So I was stuck in a rut for a while, until that package arrived. I was at home, still scrolling for a stupid DVD, until I heard the sound of something being pushed into my letterbox. I caught a hold of it before my dog did, and looked at the package. It seemed to be wrapped fairly badly, with what looked like grease marks and stains on it. Naturally, like anyone would, I decided to open the package. Inside was something that I could not explain. It was a Max and Ruby DVD, but I hadn't seen one like it online. It was like some little kid had drawn on the front cover with a marker. The title was just Max and Ruby, with what looked like a poorly drawn illustration of Max and Ruby on the front. There were no names or anything, but on the back it had a list of 4 episodes, all with blunt titles. Episode 0001, Episode 0002, 0003, and 0004. I gave the DVD a watch over, and to my surprise, the episodes were all perfect quality and seemed to have no flaws. It was as if it was a real DVD, just with a homemade cover. The only thing I thought was odd was the episode selection screen. The episodes had names, but they were all called Max and Ruby 1, with the numbers being changed as it went down the list. The actual selection screen was just a plain white screen with black text with the episode list, and nothing else. After giving it much thought, I decided to change the cover to something a little nicer by printing out a DVD cover that I had found on Google, and tracked down the names of the episodes so they were labeled right. I left the episode list screen alone, because I figured it was self-explanatory. Christmas went by, and things were fine. I gave my little cousin her DVD, and she was happy with it all through Christmas. But that was only because she hadn't watched it yet. On Boxing Day, the family had gone out for a meal, and left me to babysit my cousin. I wasn't too bothered about being left at home. I figured now was a good time to put on the DVD for her. I had put the DVD in and let it play, while I was in the kitchen eating my dinner. From what I could hear, she had watched episodes 1 to 3 so far. I was just about to finish off my noodles, when I heard my cousin screaming from the other room. Dropping everything, I had ran into the living room and saw my cousin curled up on the floor screaming. I had looked up at the TV and felt my heart in my throat. What I caught a glimpse of was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. It was what appeared to be a frame of Max and Ruby standing next to each other in complete darkness. But what made it so horrible was their lack of faces. They had lost their noses and mouths, and their eyes were replaced with big hollow holes. The colors were a disgusting blood red, and there was faint static in the background. The sound was replaced with what sounded like the Max and Ruby theme playing backwards, with a faint sound of static in the mix of it all. It had to be the most disturbing thing I had ever seen, and it must have been on the screen for at least 20 seconds before the screen went black and the DVD turned off, which alone was weird because DVDs do not usually turn off by themselves. I was able to calm my cousin down, telling her it wasn't real, and she had just had a nightmare and had fallen asleep in front of the TV. However, I knew in my mind it was completely real. My parents had rung me up and told me they were going to be out all night, so this was going to be the best opportunity to look at this DVD more closely. I didn't mention it to them, and as soon as they hung up, I grabbed the DVD and stuck it on my laptop. As soon as it loaded, I noticed that episode 0004 had now been replaced with R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy, which sent a deep chill down my back. Since my cousin was now asleep, I plugged in my earbuds so she could sleep without having to hear anything. Normally, an episode of Max and Ruby would have 3 short stories, but this episode only had 1. It started off quite lighthearted. Max and Ruby were playing tag in the garden, and their parents were on the porch watching them play. However, something was off. The sound was playing in reverse, and the parents' faces were that of sadness. A film grain became present, which grew worse and worse every second, and it panned to the mother and father, and in a voice of deep sorrow, the father spoke. "It's such a shame," he sighed. It then cut to the sound of static and a large scream, followed by the sound of 2 people choking, while the mother and father mumbled to each other in the background, but it was impossible to understand them. The sounds were so realistic it made me almost physically sick. The screen cut to white for a split second, then the scene transitioned over to Max and Ruby, standing in front of what looked like a gravestone labeled R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy. The 2 of them had no faces. At this point there was no sound, apart from faint static. The scene remained on screen for about 1.5 minutes, before it cut away into black. It then changed scene again, now showing Max and Ruby sitting in Ruby's room, while undecipherable whispering became apparent and grew louder over time. Both of them were sobbing uncontrollably, while transparent clips of a murder playing in reverse flashed on the screen. The father pulled a knife out of his neck, picked up a bloody axe, and hacked away at the corpse of the mother before she came back to life and he walked up the stairs. By this point, the whispering became louder, but more of the whispering voices started to disappear, and the very second it came down to one voice. It was a rather angry woman's voice, who screamed, "Burn in hell!" I was absolutely horrified. The scene had changed to the most disgusting, yet saddest thing I have ever witnessed. It showed Max sitting in his room. He was standing on a chair with a noose hanging from the ceiling. He had brought it around his neck. The scene faded to black, and the static got louder. Almost instantly, it then cut to Ruby walking in on her brother. She let out a gut-twisting scream. The camera was panned on her face as the sound of the chair being kicked and the same choking from before began to play. The picture of Ruby's face stayed on screen for a good 5 minutes. This time, her eyes had returned as the same gaping holes. Ruby then started crying, and as before, there were no other facial features. The static grew louder and drowned out the sound of her cries. The scene cut to black with a loud static. When the screen returned, Ruby was sitting, now on her own, in the garden by 2 gravestones. One was labeled R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy, and the other, R.I.P. Brother. She then started to look at the camera with glowing blue pupils, then spoke to me. "Well, whoever's watching this is because you never watched any of me and my brother's episodes, so one of these days, you will regret this." The screen had faded to black afterwards. At this point, I had already been sick and was sitting all shaken. The episode seemed to have come to an end at last, as the Max and Ruby theme song played slowly in reverse. I was about to eject the DVD when the same image came up like it did on the TV. This time, however, there was text above the 2 rabbits that said, "Death is our only release." There were no credits or anything else. It stayed on this for a few seconds before the DVD finally popped out of my laptop. I sat there trying to contemplate what had happened. In my shock and fear, I made the stupid decision to break the DVD up as much as I could before leaving the house, shove the pieces down the drain. Thankfully, I kept a few screenshots and saved them to my laptop. The next couple of days went past without anything unusual happening. I had a few nightmares about the DVD, but luckily that was all. My cousin had gone back home, along with the rest of the family. It was a late night, and my parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me to watch TV. I heard what sounded like someone posting something through the door. At this point, the DVD had left my mind, since I hadn't told anyone about it. However, it all came flooding back when I looked down at the letter in front of me. It was just messily folded up, and it read, "Death is our only release." This is one that I'd be really interested to know when it came around, because it definitely feels like a product of the early 2010s. And I can only see something like this getting this much attention back then, because otherwise, wow, what a fountain of cliches. And the problem with these things, I don't think any of these cliches are necessarily bad on their own. It's the fact that it seems like it's going out of its way to be as disturbing as possible, and you can always tell this when it's very mired in description, rather than actually feeling like it's leading somewhere. This is something that I'm going to end up talking about a lot in this video, but I feel like these things are at their weakest when they're deriving their main source of scares from just describing increasingly disturbing images and ideas in a show where it doesn't belong. And in this case, it's really emphasizing the distortion and, the violence and that kind of imagery, but it doesn't really feel like it's for some purpose. I mean, it's actually kind of ridiculous once it starts directly addressing the viewer and saying, "Yep, this is because you never watched any of my shows." Even though they literally were looking for the show to begin with, so I don't know. It doesn't feel like any of these things are happening for any particular reason. It feels like these things are happening because they were trying to think of scary things that could happen in Max and Ruby. These things are being shown to us because this is a video where horror happens, and the imagery isn't in service to any greater themes or anything like that. It's just there because it's trying to be disturbing on its face. Not only that, but it's so extreme so early that it feels like it's just trying way too hard. It's doing the cliche of having real gore flash on the screen and everything's playing in reverse and the static was so blaring. In other words, it's kind of all style, no substance, and even the style is incredibly derivative, which is why it makes me think that because this is apparently so popular, it probably came out right in the middle of when these things were taking off. Because I could see it maybe being a bit scary if you've never read a Lost Episode creepypasta before. Even Dead Bart had some context, some backstory behind it to influence why what we were seeing was creepy. But this, it really is just a description of an episode. Everything around it is pretty much just fluff. I will say, there is one line that I found a little bit creepy, and it's probably more by accident than anything. But this one, "The father pulled a knife out of his neck, picked up a bloody axe, and hacked away at the corpse of mother before she came back to life and he walked up the stairs." You know what? I actually read that wrong the first time. I read that wrong the first time, and it made it creepier than I thought it was, because I thought it said she came back to life and walked up the stairs. But it's Daddy Pig who walks up the stairs. I had a creepy image in my head of this murder victim just standing up and silently walking away. The thing is, I'm kind of tearing it apart here, but I'm actually really glad that I read this because it serves as a great example of what I think a majority of this genre is. It's got a lot wrong with it, but it's not too different in presentation from something like Dead Bart. It's just that you can always feel when the goal was to make a creepypasta about something that didn't have one yet, rather than actually being based on an idea. Everyone remembers the show Doug, one of the original 3 Nicktoons. It seemed like a pretty normal show about the challenges a young boy faced in his daily life, but I always got a weird kind of feeling from it. Compared to other kids' shows, Doug seemed more negative and anxiety-centered. Doug was always worried about something, and in most episodes he would have fantasies of everyone he knew cruelly laughing at him due to whatever problem he was facing that week. Doug always came through in the end, though, and every episode ended with him writing in his journal about how he had overcome his blown-out-of-proportion problem. In 2003, I began to have dreams about the show for no apparent reason. I can't remember the details, but they made me want to see the show again. The show hadn't even been seen in reruns for years at that point, so I couldn't think of any way to see it again. To my surprise, however, it came back for 1 week in fall of 2003, airing at 6 a.m. on weekdays. I watched it for all 5 days. The first 4 were episodes I remembered, but they didn't sync up with my memories perfectly. It had been a while, so I just chalked it up to flaws in my memory. The Friday episode, though, was something I was positive I had never seen before. It started with the normal intro with the line drawings, but the characters never appeared. The lines continued as normal, acting as if the normal characters were there. Once the intro ended, it switched to show Doug in a dark room, writing in his journal. He was not narrating his writing like he usually did. He just silently wrote for about a minute. The screen faded out, and the usual episode title screen appeared. Yet there was no skip this time. There were just giant letters, forming the title, Doug's Real Life. The episode opened with Doug eating breakfast. He was giving a voiceover about how there was a big test he had neglected studying for. As his family was having a normal conversation, the screen started flashing. The flashes seemed to be showing something, but they didn't last long enough for me to figure out what they were revealing. Doug left his house and began walking to school. During his stroll, he had one of his fantasies about his life being ruined. Mrs. Wingo announced that Doug had flunked the test, and the entire class was laughing at him, with their heads swirling around Doug. This went on for longer than most fantasies, and the laughter sounded crueler than usual. When Doug got to school, the screen flashed again. This time it stayed on the new image, or rather, the new animation style. The colors were darker, and many objects had changed color. It resembled a negative film. Doug was walking through the school hallway, which was full of kids who had never been seen on the show before. No one paid any attention to him. After Doug got to his desk, the animation switched back to normal. Suddenly, for no reason, the scene changed to after school had ended. Doug was walking home, worrying to himself about the test. Upon reaching his house, his dog Porkchop greeted him. Doug began talking to him, until the screen flashed. Porkchop turned into a hunk of rotting meat, and Doug's house became decrepit. Doug went into his house and acted as if he was talking to someone, though it was completely deserted. After interacting with invisible people for a while, he sat down at an empty table. The screen flashed again, and Doug's family was there with him, eating dinner. The phone rang, and Doug's mom answered it. Doug instantly thought it was his teacher telling him about flunking the test. Doug had a fantasy about his parents yelling at him for failing. In it, they grew to be gigantic, and their faces became twisted and dark red. The screen flashed back to the empty house. Doug was crying and apologizing, but there was no one else in the room. He went up to his bedroom, which was completely empty, except for a book and a pencil. Doug picked up the book and started writing. He narrated this time. I can't tell which one is real. I was actually surprised at how much I liked this one, because it manages to be just different enough to be interesting. Obviously, it's nothing new in Lost Episode creepypastas to have one that implies that, everything a main character was going through, the fantastical portions of the show, were actually just a figment of their imagination as they struggle to cope with a horrible and realistic life. And Doug is definitely a show that's really ripe for that, especially since it was a lot more mundane than a lot of others, and very rooted in fantasy to begin with. But I think it puts itself a step above, and ties it all together with a genuinely haunting ending line. I can't tell which one is real. Because not only is it more interesting from the get-go than simply implying that the reality was darker than what we saw, Doug was always about the difference between fantasy and real life, and so to see this version where he's completely lost his grip and doesn't even know which of these anxieties he should be more worried about is really, really cool. Like, there is actually real inspiration here. It also doesn't really overstay its welcome. It's mysterious how this thing just kind of comes from nowhere, and I do think that's also one of its weak points. And it's a problem that a lot of these lost episode creepypastas have, which is that they lose their sense of perspective as time goes on. Literally, the narrator's perspective. Because this is delivered to us as it just randomly aired one day after the show had ended in this weird marathon in the early morning. And that's fine, that's all well and good, but the problem is it just kind of devolves into a description of what happens in the episode. We don't have any of the narrator's thoughts as this goes on. We don't even get their retrospective thoughts after all is said and done. Now, from a writing perspective, I can understand that it's so you can end on that maximum impact of the final line. It's flawed, but what isn't? This was pretty fun. I usually like to watch TV with my little sister, Kimberly. She was only 5, so of course she watched all the cutesy kids shows. I didn't really mind though. They made her happy, and I liked spending time with her. She watched shows like Dora, Blue's Clues, and Arthur. We often had a lot of DVDs of old kids shows around the house that we would watch. There was a large box of old movies and TV shows in the attic. I took a brief look at it once, but none of them looked like they would appeal to her. One day, Kimberly was at a doctor's appointment, and I thought I'd have time to watch a movie aimed more towards my age range, so I thought this would be a good time to look through the box of old movies in the attic. When I looked through the box, I noticed that these movies didn't really interest me, but I kept looking in hopes to find something. Then I saw, at the bottom of the box, a DVD labeled Colwyn's Corner. Many memories started to come back to me. I used to watch this show as a kid. It was about an orange puppet named Colwyn, who lived in a house on the corner of a street. He would often have his other puppet friends come over to play games and sing songs. It was cute and innocent, and I remember really liking it as a kid. I thought this would be a good show for my sister and I to watch. When Kimberly got home, I told her I got a new show for us to watch. She got excited and sat down on the couch while I put the disc in. I sat down next to her as the selection screen popped up. The screen looked just as I remembered it. It showed Colwyn and his friends in front of the house. I chose the first episode, and the theme song began. I was a little confused. The colors were a lot darker than I remember, and the song was sung a lot slower and in a deeper voice. I didn't think much of it, as I hadn't seen the show in a long time, and I probably forgot some elements of it. The show began pretty normally. Colwyn was in his house and said hello to the viewers. There was a knock on his door, and he said, "I think my friends are here." When he opened the door, I felt my heart to my throat. Standing at the door were 2 tall, white puppets with no nose or mouth, only pitch-black eyes. I was shocked because I don't even remember these characters on the show. Even the cover of the DVD showed 2 colorful, friendly puppets. I looked over at Kimberly, and she had this big smile on her face. I was confused, since an image like that would terrify a child. "I'm not sure if we should watch this anymore," I told her. "No, please, keep it on," she exclaimed. I continued watching, as the giant puppets didn't seem to faze her. The 2 puppets came into the house. Colwyn asked, "What do you guys want to do today?" The one puppet replied with the most horrific sound I've ever heard. It sounded like a man was shouting, almost screaming in a strange language. The audio was very distorted. At this point, I got up and ejected the disc from the VCR, much to Kimberly's disappointment. "Why did you stop it? Put it back on," she said. I didn't listen, and put the DVD in a drawer. Even though Kimberly wasn't bothered by the show, I still thought it was too disturbing for a 5-year-old. I had trouble sleeping that night. I kept thinking about the video. I watched that show all the time when I was younger. I definitely haven't seen every episode. I didn't understand why I didn't remember an episode like this. I was still curious about the rest of the episode. I decided to go downstairs to finish it. I took the DVD out of the drawer and put it in the VCR. I put on headphones so the noise wouldn't disturb my family. The episode began the same, with a strange intro and the large puppets. After the one puppet made the terrifying sound, Colin replied, "You're right, we should play a game." He then grabbed a knife off the counter. It cut to a live-action arm, painted orange to represent Colwyn's. The knife went up to the arm and started to cut slits, each one deeper than the last. Colwyn started to scream a blood-curdling scream. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt sick to my stomach. Blood gushed out of the wounds as the screams got louder and louder. It then cut to a live-action neck, painted orange. The knife went up to the throat and cut a deep slit in it, and blood began gushing out. It showed Colwyn gasping heavily for air, before his eyes turned completely white. The episode ended with him falling to the ground, as the two tall, white puppets looked directly into the camera with pitch-black eyes. I was utterly terrified at this point. I immediately ejected the DVD and threw it in the trash. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about the episode. I got up the next morning and went downstairs to get some breakfast. I walked past Kimberly's room and saw that she wasn't there. When I got downstairs, I saw her on the couch, finishing up the horrific episode I watched last night. I immediately grabbed the remote and turned the TV off. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Where did you get the DVD?" I shouted. "It was in the garbage," she replied. "I took it out because I wanted to finish the episode." "This show is very bad," I shouted. "No, it's not," she said. "They were just baking a cake." "What?" I said. "The episode was about Colin and his friends baking a cake," she replied. I was shocked. "What did his friends look like?" I asked. "One was blue and one was red," she replied. "I really liked it. Can I watch it again?" This is another one that, while I was reading it, I didn't really feel like it was doing all that much to distinguish itself from other Lost Media creepypastas. However, it definitely brings itself up a few notches with the ending, which is, just nice and simple and creepy. But also, I really liked the framing of this, and once I noticed it, I couldn't help but compare it to the ending, because essentially what we have here is a narrator who is familiar with this show. They've outgrown it, sort of forgotten about it, and left it behind, but they have good memories, and they decide, okay, well, my little sister is in that phase now that I was in, so let's share that with her. And when they're both watching it, it's really interesting how the one who is familiar with this thing sees it as something horrifying, as something that's corrupted in retrospect, while the younger kid who has no expectation whatsoever sees something that's basically what the narrator thought it would be. I'd really have to think about this some more, and there's not really a whole lot of material to work off of here. It's a very short story. But I really feel like there's something here about how, over time, like a more matured perspective can alter the way we view even our own cherished memories. Or maybe there's gore in this kid's show and that doesn't belong there and that's scary. I don't know. When you're 5, your mind lacks the experience to make informed judgments or connect things which aren't obvious. Over the years, the details get fuzzy and forgotten. Speaking with my parents the other day, they cleared the cobwebs burying this story. I remember now, much too clearly, the story of Gurgles and Bugman. I just started kindergarten that year. Everyone's a friend when you're 5, so I had no shortage of classmates. But coming from a poor family, I didn't get to see too much of them outside of school. My parents spent all their waking hours trying to make ends meet, and didn't have time to ferry me from house to house. So I spent my early years mostly keeping to myself. playing with the random assortment of knickknacks from the shelf in my room. Being short of money gave my family a habit of hoarding, so they hated to throw anything out. One particular item on the shelf was a small, old-fashioned TV set, a wooden veneer box about 2 feet wide by a foot tall. It had a curved glass screen that took up half the front panel. Beside the screen was a large chrome dial used to switch channels. At the top sat an antenna, formed by 2 terribly twisted wires. When my boredom made me turn it on, I'd usually just get static and snow on that glowing black and white screen. I'd twist the heavy clicking dial, hoping to pick up some local broadcasts. Mostly it would be some ghostly images and incoherent sound fragments. But one channel was always crystal clear. It was the Gurgles and Bugman show. Gurgles was a clown, but not a common one. He wore a thin black suit that draped his tall, skinny body, with a matching tie and oversized novelty clown shoes to complete his distinctive outfit. His pupils were completely black, like polished ebony marbles, with no trace of white around them. Black face paint around those eyes and across his cheeks and mouth made him look like a manic, grinning skeleton. It was only the crazy crop of curly hair sprouting off the sides of his head that gave him a more human look. As much as Gurgles freaked me out, Bugman scared me more. He was short and round, like a hunchbacked dwarf with a dark cape. He had prosthetics covering his eyes to make him look like a fly, and a mouth that was rotated 90 degrees and opened from side to side. The show itself was like candid camera, with pranks played on unsuspecting people. It would always start with Gurgles and Bugman hidden away in someone's home. Gurgles would face the camera, staring at you, his bony finger touching his lips. When the unsuspecting star of the show came into view, a laugh track would begin to play. You would see them go about their nightly routines, oblivious to the conspiracy that Gurgles and Bugman had involved us in. We'd see them making dinner or in the lounge watching TV with their family, or quietly doing their homework. Then we'd watch as Gurgles and Bugman stole their pen or moved their glass or made things disappear behind their backs. The camera angles would change as Gurgles and Bugman shifted their hiding place from the dark corners of a room to the cupboards, to the ceiling, or under the furniture, all the while looking back at you and winking. The closer they got, the louder and more laughter from the soundtrack. Eventually, when everyone went to sleep, a victim would be chosen for their prank. Waiting in the closet or under the bed, Bugman would crawl out and gently climb in beside them. His jaw would open sideways, and out would come a sharp straw that he'd stick in the person's neck. This always paralyzed the victim, because sometimes you could see them struggle if they woke and saw Gurgles and Bugman on top of them. The laugh track would be extra loud and uproarious those few times the victims awoke. Gurgles would make faces at the camera while the audience laughed, and Bugman would use his straw to drink from the person's neck. When the victim stopped struggling after a few minutes, the laughter would turn to claps and cheering. With Bugman finished, Gurgles' face would fill the whole screen with his impossibly wide, sharp-toothed grin. Then he'd whisper, "See you again soon." The way those all-black eyes pierced through the screen always gave me the chills. I hated the show, but would always be too afraid to go near the TV while it was running. One day, the TV mysteriously disappeared from my room. My parents told my 5-year-old self that they sold it to pay some bills. I accepted that without question. I was kinda glad it was gone. But yesterday, when I asked them about that TV again, they exchanged nervous glances, then filled in some missing gaps from my childhood. Halfway through that year, Derek, a classmate I didn't know very well, died in horrific circumstances. He was murdered in his bed, with a stab wound to the neck. No evidence of a break-in was ever found, so his distraught parents were taken into custody as the primary suspects. They denied all the allegations against them. At the time, Mrs. Nolan, my teacher, was the one to tell our class. I apparently explained to her that Derek couldn't be dead because I saw him and his family on the Gurgles and Bugman show the day before. When Mrs. Nolan mentioned to my parents what I'd said, they had immediately taken the TV from my room, driven it to a junkyard, and had it burnt to nothing but ashes and molten metal. That TV was in my room because it had always been broken. It was never plugged in the whole time it sat on my shelf. Whatever I saw on that screen, it wasn't from a station. So that's my story of Gurgles and Bugman, but I'm not sure if that's really the end though. After all, do Gurgles and Bugman still perform their nightly show for some unsuspecting viewer somewhere in this world? And if so, who will be their next star? I can't believe I haven't heard of this one before because I found that really, really creepy. And out of all of these, it's the one where the contents of the lost media itself is probably the most understated. It's the kind of thing that's unnerving on its own, but the fear is very much retroactive, and that's something that's really, really good to do in a story about a recalled childhood memory. The kind of thing that is disturbing in the moment, but gets so much worse with some additional bit of context that they are only now putting together. I feel like for a lot of us, childhood memories are very strong. They're images that have been with us for our entire lives, but they come in fragments, and when you're able to join those pieces together and only years later realize the potential danger or implications, that's a real sinking feeling that goes way beyond just describing the most messed up events possible, which is where a lot of these creepypastas fail. And it doesn't feel the need to over-explain itself. We never learn what the deal was with this TV, why this kid was seemingly chosen to see this. And by this point, there's no one to tell, there's nothing to do with that information. Even if they did tell someone, what are they going to say? There's no proof, there's no nothing. And so they just kind of have to live with the knowledge of what they saw, leaving the implications that something like this could still be out there, or that their memories really are that corrupted. And it is the implications here that make this so creepy. I mean, it feels much more like a message than just a random thing that they happen to witness, when you realize that they shouldn't have been able to witness it in the first place, that seemingly nobody else knows about this. Or maybe the parents do? I mean, they seemed pretty disturbed, but to just take a child's word for that, I don't know, maybe there's some history to that TV that we haven't heard, but it's committed to the storyteller's perspective. We don't know anything they don't, and we don't know it until they do. Something I talk about pretty often is how I think a lot of us have these childhood memories that we look back on and think, that couldn't possibly have happened the way I remember it, and yet it's so clear and vivid in your mind. So when you see something that makes you realize that maybe there was something more to it, and I think part of what makes it so unsettling is that the show itself feels like a child's fever dream. It's so structured as like child logic. So the implication that such a thing could actually have been real and presented in reality with child logic, for some reason, even that feels wrong.